Come now, little man, put aside your business for a while. Take refuge for a little from your tumultuous thoughts. Cast off your cares and let your burdensome distractions wait. These are the words of St. Anselm of Canterbury as he prepares our minds for what is, perhaps, the best argument for the existence of God. God is that which nothing greater can be conceived. To exist is greater than not to exist. Therefore, God exists. This argument might not look like much, and there are many more details to discuss. But as the philosopher Bertrand Russell once said, it is easier to feel convinced that the ontological argument must be fallacious than it is to find out precisely where the fallacy lies. Hello everybody, and welcome to Immaterial Minds, a place to talk about profound ideas and imperfect lives. I'm Chris, the immaterial voice, and this is Mr. Reaper, my more material companion. If you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe, and I hope you enjoy this journey into the depths of the ontological argument. The story of the ontological argument begins with a curious tale. The theologian Edmer, a contemporary biographer of Anselm, writes that when Anselm was formulating the ontological argument, he became so consumed with his thoughts that he gave up food and drink and even sleep to the point that it began to interfere with his religious duties. At one point, Anselm even began to believe that the whole project might be some great temptation by the devil, some kind of plot contrived to distract him from his work. But it was just when Anselm was about to give up on his project completely that a solution appeared before his mind. Edmer writes that in a flash of inspiration, Anselm quickly wrote down the entire of the ontological argument on wax tablets. He then gave these wax tablets to a fellow monk at his monastery to take care of. The problem is that this monk unfortunately lost the tablets, so Anselm had to write down from memory the whole argument again, which he did. But once he'd done that, for some reason that doesn't make much sense to me, he gave this second set of tablets to the same monk to look after. This time, the monk went and found the tablets later had been broken. We might begin to wonder whether the devil was in fact trying to suppress the ontological argument rather than to motivate it. In any case, for a third time, Anselm wrote down the ontological argument, this time on parchment, which was not immediately lost or destroyed. Finally, the ontological argument was safe, and it was soon after this that Anselm published the argument in his work, the Proslogion. It's in this work that Anselm most intimately combines philosophy and prayer in order to achieve his ultimate goal, faith-seeking understanding, or fides quaerens intellectum. The Proslogion consists of 26 chapters all exploring the nature of God, but it's on this single page that the core of the ontological argument appears. That's all it takes, one page, to establish the existence of God. Now, this is where the argument begins. Anselm tells us that even a fool can conceive of God as something than which nothing greater can be thought, or, as is sometimes said, conceived. In other words, understanding God isn't outside of the scope of anyone's cognitive ability, not even the fool's who does not, according to Anselm, already believe in the existence of God. So, Mr. Reaper, what do you think about that? Can you conceive of God? Okay, never mind, but this next part's super important. Anselm draws a distinction between something just existing in the mind and something existing in reality. This is what he says. Reaper, pull up the screen. For it is one thing for an object to exist in the mind, and another thing to understand that an object actually exists. This distinction is not supposed to create some great metaphysical divide between the mind and the world. The point is just that some things can be thought or imagined that do not necessarily exist in the world. For example, Mr. Reaper, you can imagine a dragon, right? How about a unicorn? Good. Now how about a triangle with 4 sides? Ha, exactly. You can't imagine that. But the thing is, there are things that you can imagine that don't exist in the world. Good. Now, this brings us back to the crux of the argument. Anselm writes this: "Surely that than which a greater cannot be thought cannot exist in the mind alone. For if it exists solely in the mind even, it can be thought to exist in reality also, which is greater." In other words, and recall that this is one of the most important principles of the whole argument, it is assumed that existence in reality is greater than mere existence in the mind. And what that means is that God must exist, because if he didn't, then we, even us fools, would be able to imagine something greater. But we can't, because God is, by definition, the greatest thing that we can conceive. Now here we have it in Anselm's own words. "If then, that than which a greater cannot be thought exists in the mind alone, this same that than which a greater cannot be thought is that than which a greater can be thought. But this is obviously impossible. Therefore, there is absolutely no doubt that something than which a greater cannot be thought exists both in the mind and in reality. And as it happens, this thing is, by definition, God." Mr. Reaper, let's get the argument up on the screen. God is that which nothing greater can be conceived. To exist is greater than not to exist. Therefore, God exists. So what do you think? It makes a lot of sense, right? Oh, come on. Look, we start with the assumption that God is the greatest conceivable thing, and we're led to the conclusion that he must exist. Why? Because if he didn't, then we could conceive of something greater. That is, the same thing as God, but existing. But we can't do that because God is, by definition, the greatest conceivable thing. It's basically a kind of reductio argument. Well, I wouldn't say that, but the ontological argument is certainly controversial, even dating back all the way to Anselm's day. Do you want to know why? Well then, Mr. Reaper, you can tell me. Reaper, look, that's not an argument. Let's take a closer look at some of the real objections. One of Anselm's contemporaries, another Catholic monk named Gaunilo, was quick to point out that Anselm's logic could be used to prove the existence of a perfect, well, pretty much anything, which he thought is absurd. In a work that Gaunilo called A Reply on Behalf of the Fool, Gaunilo gives the example of a perfect island, which he calls the Lost Island. He describes it as follows. "The story goes that it is blessed with all manner of priceless riches and delights in abundance, much more even than the Happy Isles, and, having no owner or inhabitant, it is superior everywhere in abundance of riches to all those other lands that men inhabit. In other words, it is the greatest island that one could possibly conceive." Now, using Anselm's own logic, since this lost island is by definition the greatest conceivable island, and since existence is greater than non-existence, the island, just like God, must in fact exist. And as Gaunilo continues, "If I say someone wishes thus to persuade me that this island really exists beyond all doubt, I should either think that he was joking, or I should find it hard to decide which of us I ought to judge the bigger fool." So, Mr. Reaper, what do you think about that reply? No, it doesn't work like that. Anyway, there is an even more influential objection to the ontological argument, and it appeared about 700 years later, in the work of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Existence is not a predicate. Existence is not a predicate. Existence is not a predicate. If you've studied the ontological argument before, you've almost certainly heard this phrase stated as though it was an obvious truth. In actual fact, it's quite a subtle point, one that was far from obvious at least until the time of Kant. In his critique of pure reason, in a section called The Impossibility of an Ontological Proof of the Existence of God, Kant distinguishes between logical predicates and real predicates. A logical predicate is anything that can be predicated on, or in a sense added to, a concept that doesn't actually add anything to the concept itself. This is what Kant says about logical predicates. Anything we please can be made to serve as a logical predicate. The subject can even be predicated of itself. for logic abstracts from all content. But a real predicate is something that adds to the concept being described. Let's take a moment to think about triangles. Logically, we can say of triangles that they are red or blue or green or purple or whatever. These are all perfectly acceptable logical predicates of triangles. They might even turn out to be true of some particular triangles. But to establish whether they're true of some triangle, we have to look at the world. The colour of any particular triangle is an empirical matter, or to use Kant's terminology, it is an a posteriori matter. But now these are some other things we might say about triangles. We might say that they have 3 sides, or that they have 3 interior angles, or etc. These are real predicates, in the sense that they describe real essential features of triangles. But importantly, we know these facts about triangles without looking at the world. You don't need to observe a particular triangle to say that it will have 3 sides. It's a conceptual truth about triangles. Again, to put this in Kant's terminology, we can say that these are a priori truths about triangles. Okay, so this is an extremely simplified account of Kant's epistemology, but hopefully we're going to get the picture. Now imagine that we want to add an existence predicate to triangles. We want to say, triangles exist. There are 2 corresponding ways that we might interpret this claim. We might interpret it as an a posteriori truth about triangles, or we might interpret it as an a priori truth about triangles. In the first case, it might well be true that some triangle exists in the world. To say as such would be essentially the same as saying that some triangle is a particular colour. But here's the thing. The only way to confirm this as an a posteriori truth about triangles is by looking for a triangle in the world. It's not something that can be derived from the meaning of triangle alone. In contrast, we can try to interpret existence as an a priori truth about triangles. This would be a kind of fact that enlarges, in Kant's words, our understanding of the concept triangle. The problem with this is that it's just not going to work. To say that triangles exist a priori adds nothing to our understanding of triangles. We know what triangle means without any real triangles. It's in this sense that existence is not a real predicate. Once we have a complete understanding of a concept, adding existence to that understanding doesn't in fact add anything. The definition of the concept holds whether or not that thing exists in real life. And the same is true of triangles, squares, tables, numbers, chairs, unicorns, dragons, and, for that matter, God. Now are you following this, Mr. Reaper? Well, if you have to insist that existence is an essential feature of triangles, then you're just presupposing exactly what you're trying to prove, namely, that triangles exist. This is what Kant would call nothing but a miserable tautology. Well, aren't we all? Now it's for this reason that Kant says specifically, being is obviously not a real predicate. That is, it is not a concept of something which could be added to the concept of a thing. With this in mind, we can finally begin to see what Kant really means when he applies all of this reasoning to God and the ontological argument. This is a long passage, but it really captures the essence of Kant's objection. If now we take the subject, God, with all of its predicates and say God is, or there is a God, we attach no new predicate to the concept of God, but only posit the subject in itself with all of its predicates, and indeed posit it as being an object that stands in relation to my concept. The content of both must be one and the same. Nothing can have been added to the concept, which expresses merely what is possible, by my thinking its object, through the expression it is, as given absolutely. Otherwise stated, the real contains no more than the merely possible. In the end, Kant closes his section on the ontological argument by saying, we can no more extend our stock of theoretical insight by mere ideas than a merchant can better his position by adding a few noughts to his cash account. So, Mr. Reaper, do you agree with Kant? Right, that sounds right. Oh, come on, Reaper. You can do better than that. Now, despite these criticisms, and perhaps in part because of them, the ontological argument has continued to intrigue philosophers for almost a millennium. Since the work of St. Anselm, the philosopher Descartes has given his own version of the ontological argument. Leibniz has extended the original argument to fill in some of the details that he thought were missing, and the most well-known recent defender of a version of the ontological argument appears in the work of the contemporary Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga. And of course, there have been many other defenders and opponents along the way. Ultimately, for me personally, the issue boils down to one of the longest-standing philosophical problems. Can reason alone be used to establish truths about the world? As Bertrand Russell once said, every philosopher would like to say yes, because a philosopher's job is to find out things about the world by thinking rather than observing. But who knows? Perhaps it's just all some big misguided puzzle. Thanks for watching this video by Immaterial Minds. If you'd like to see more, then please take a moment to subscribe. And remember, it's all immaterial.